Are we bound to always follow Scripture as it is written, or can we adapt it to modern circumstances and sensibilities? As you might imagine, there are strong feelings out there about this question. Let's see what we can figure out. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas. And this is your daily devotional for Wednesday, March 5th, 2025. One of the most misunderstood and most abused passages in the Bible is Paul's famous, or infamous, depending on your perspective, advice regarding husbands and wives. Wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord, he says. I don't need to tell you that this passage has become somewhat of a Rorschach test of how we understand the Bible. For those who see the Bible as containing immutable, unchanging rules, this passage points to the idea that God has forever ordained men to be superior to women. But others see something else going on, something that doesn't have anything to do with fixed gender roles. I believe that when Paul wrote these words in the context of the Gentile world of his time, they were meant to be liberating. Instead of wives being little more than chattel slaves, Paul called for a new way of life, still recognizable enough to the Gentiles, but one in which wives were valued, in which the well-being of wives mattered. It was a much more mutual relationship than the ordinary place wives held in that day and age. So the takeaway is not so much that wives are to be subservient, but that husbands and wives should love one another. Or, to use Paul's primary language, husbands and wives should be subject to one another. Subservience is not the operative term here. Mutuality is. In some households, maybe that does mean complementary gender roles, but only if both partners agree to it. In other households, though, it looks more like the marriage of two co-equal partners, neither of whom dominates, but both of whom make the well-being of the other of primary importance in their own lives. No need for dominance, no need for subservience. Paul goes on in this section of Ephesians to describe two other household relationships, children to parents and parents to children, and slaves to masters and masters to slaves. In the context of his day, these pieces of guidance were actually pretty revolutionary. Husbands and wives were to live in a mutually loving relationship. Children were to respect parents, and parents were to refrain from provoking their children to anger. Slaves were to obey masters, and masters were to treat slaves with kindness and respect. Now, here's the deal. To assume that the Bible is saying that husbands and wives live in an unalterable, God-ordained relationship of superior and inferior also means assuming that the institution of slavery is also ordained by God. Practically no reasonable person in our day and age would agree that God has ordained slavery. What I'm saying is that we should keep our eye on the ball here. It's not about wives being subservient any more than insisting that slavery is okay. What's at stake is not freezing first-century arrangements in place. It's about pointing toward a new life in which relationships have a mutual element. Mutuality, not subservience, is what's at stake here. So, if Paul's purpose was not to define for all time the exact relationship dynamics between husbands and wives, parents and children, slaves and masters, what was he after? And how can we adapt his words to guide us today? For not even the most legalistic interpreters would say that Paul's advice regarding masters and slaves applies to us today. Now, if we accept that slavery is not a God-ordained institution, then can we assume that wives being subservient to husband is also not? I think so. But does that mean we simply ignore the Bible when it is inconvenient or apparently not in line with modern values? Does it mean we simply reject Paul? Well, some do. Some today brand Paul as a misogynist, one who hated women. I think that's unfair. It calls to mind a category of something we call presentism. Presentism is the idea that the present judges historical writings and people by the standards of the present world. I think we can still learn from Paul if we focus on the deeper message and don't presume to freeze first-century household relationships in place. Paul's revolutionary message is, if we can see it, is that in Christian households, we are to practice mutual love and care. If in your household the husband is the head and that still means that wives are subservient, well, it still means you have to care for one another. But if in your household both spouses are co-equal, it also means mutual love and care. All of which is to say, we don't need to freeze ancient practices in place and assume those practices must be the norm for today. But being wise, discerning, and faithful followers of Jesus Christ, we seek together to find the deeper meaning of passages like this section from Ephesians. And if we do, well, it turns out Paul is remarkably relevant today, if we'll bother to read him carefully and think deeply and with wisdom. Tomorrow, imagine God. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.